So if you're having any trouble hearing, please try moving to the front and hopefully be able to hear clearly. The event is being recorded by the East-West Center staff, so just be aware that it might appear on some website sometime. If anybody has concerns about that, you can communicate that with Zoe. So my name is Len Shapa. I'm from the politics department here at UVA, and I'm the interim director of the East Asia Center, stepping in for Ann Kokas, who has been serving the last couple of years. We're really pleased to have a team of people from the East-West Center joining us today as part of their rollout for a report that they're going to tell us about, looking at the way various Asian countries spanning from India all the way to Japan are thinking about the upcoming election. And you'll get to hear how India, Southeast Asia, Japan, Korea, China, all of them are thinking about a possible return of President Trump, as well as the possible continuation of the Biden-Harris style leadership under the Democratic Party. And you will see that Asian countries are not going to be super frank or take clear positions on who they prefer, but they have to prepare, because the United States remains an important, very important player for all of these countries. When I speak about Japan in a few minutes, you'll hear that for the Japanese, it's sort of an indispensable country, and that certainly affects how they think about the election. So the East-West Center is a nonprofit research institute headquartered in Hawaii, adjacent to the University of Hawaii campus, which focuses on the Indo-Pacific region. Thanks to years of support from Senator Daniel Inouye, it has received steady funding from the U.S. government, but is also supported by foundations and other governments in the region, running programs that bring together scholars and officials from these nations that span the Asia-Pacific region. Its DC office, from which the visitors today have traveled, has a particular mission to, quote, prepare the United States for an era of growing Asia-Pacific prominence. In a moment, we're going to be joined up here by our two visitors who are part of our panel. And today's visit it's sort of a trade. Ann Kokas, as I mentioned, was the East Asia Center director, and she will be again next year. This year is at the East-West Center in Hawaii. So in exchange for us sending her over to Hawaii, we get one day with the DC staff sharing some of their thoughts. I'm especially pleased to host Satu Limaye, the director of the EAC, the director of the East-West Center in Washington, D.C., and an old friend. So we were classmates at Georgetown. I think our very last semester at Georgetown, we were in a class on Western European politics together. And then, when I went over to Oxford, he was also going over to Oxford, as he was there as a Marshall Scholar. So I'm really pleased to have him come to Charlottesville, believe it or not, the first time that I've been able to host him in all the years that I've been here. So it's high time that we brought him up here to join us. He has particular expertise on South Asia and Southeast Asia, so you'll hear him talking especially about those regions, but he's long been interested not just in the general orientation of those countries, in their foreign policies, but in their specific strategies vis-a-vis East Asia. So he really was the ideal person to head up the DC office, because he's been thinking about especially East Asia, China relations long before it suddenly became a high-profile relationship that people were paying more attention to. So Nicholas Hamisevicz is program director for the Election Report Project at the East-West Center. He earned his PhD from Catholic University, where he wrote his dissertation on the effectiveness of strategic partnerships in Asia. So you can see again what a good fit he is for the mission of this organization. His particular expertise is on Korea, and he writes about both North Korea and South Korea. So we will get to hear a lot more about that when he joins us. So with no further ado, I'm going to invite the two panelists to join us. We're going to speak seated positions, and then we'll transition to moderated discussion.
Terrific. Well, first of all, good morning. Thank you for taking the time on this beautiful autumn morning. Great to see you again, Lynn, and wonderful to have you as our host here. Say a little bit more. I was asked initially to spend maybe 10 minutes laying out the report. But in order to do so, I think I have to explain where its origins are, why this institution is doing this kind of report, and also what this report is not. Because I'll get in a lot of trouble if I don't explain that. The East-West Center was established by the Congress, so it's authorized by the Congress and appropriated, that is to say, funded by the Congress. But as Lynn said, not only. We get money from the foundations, private sector, regional governments, etc. And the reason that's important is our congressional mission language is very particular and specific. We bring Americans and Asians together to do collaborative study and research. And therefore, all of our products, we are not a traditional DC think tank where you have senior fellows of various kinds producing, in many cases, wonderful work about what U.S. policy should be, what this should be, what that should be. Our content and our products are generally the methodologies to bring American thinking and Asian thinking together to produce something that's joint. So in the final report, you'll see listed all of those who agreed have their names listed and all the institutions in Asia. That's an important. Second thing is that this report is not about regional views of the election qua election. It's a report about U.S.-Asian policy in the context of the 24 elections. And our other co-author, who's not here, is Dr. Robert Sutter. Many of you will know him. He's a very distinguished academic, former National Intelligence Officer for East Asia in the U.S. government. So he couldn't join us today, but of course sends his regards, and he'll be here for our virtual launch on the 29th. The third thing I want to say is this report is part of a product line at the East-West Center called Asia Matters for America. And it has a number of facets. I can't go into all of them, but what I wanted to flag for you, and there's some flyers and available publications for you that Zoe had brought. Just not spill everything. This is a publication called Asia Matters for America, and it maps out Asia's impact on every U.S. state and congressional district. Trade, investment, students, sister city partnership, National Guard partnerships, military exchanges. Next year's version will have lay down of Asian troops parked in the United States, operating from the United States, and other features. But the point of this report is for every member of Congress to be able to see how their state and congressional districts are impacted by interaction in Asia. There are versions of this report for Japan, Korea, ASEAN, APEC, Pacific Islands, Mekong region, etc. So it's very simple to remember, AsiaMattersForAmerica.org. The reason I mention this chapeau or this cover is this series is part of a line of work at the East-West Center that is on U.S.-Asia relations, explaining America to Asia and Asia to the United States and what the importance and elements of this relationship are. So, coincident with this report, we will on the 29th also release our second edition of the Asia Matters for America poll of American elites and public. And that is, what do American elites, officials at the local level, business people, experts, think about Asia, and how do publics view Asia? Everything from climate change to technology to trade to investment. And we do this report in collaboration with the University of Chicago's National Opinion Research Center. So those are some framings of the report. I wanted you to understand why we do it, how we do it, where it fits into our line of work. We do many other things. If you go to eastwestcenter.org, you will see fellowships, exchanges, leadership programs, conferences, publications of various kinds, but this is in this series of this Asia Matters for America line of effort. Now, let me get to the heart of the thing and end with that, and then we'll have plenty of time in this curated discussion that Len has so kindly agreed to do. I want to flag two things in our title. Our title is Asia Navigates Uncertainty and Continuity of U.S. Regional Policy in the 2024 elections. This is, I said, the third report. The first report was generic because, yeah, I can share it. I was nervous about what to call the first report because 2016 was a particularly contentious and fraught year about U.S.-Asia policy. And since we are a congressional nonpartisan institution, I just wanted to call it what it was, which was an election report and Asian responses. We went out on a limb in 2020 and we called our report a hardening U.S.-China competition because we discerned that by 2020, after the release of the Trump administration's 2017 national security strategy, we'd gotten into a much harder U.S.-China strategic competition era, particularly buttressed by movements in the United States Congress. Now in 2024, we're calling it uncertainty, navigating uncertainty and continuity. Let me explain those two terms. Uncertainty is not just about President Trump or Harris. Certainly, different countries, we're talking about a large area, large countries, big important countries, lots of views. There are distinct views. But we found that issue less frontal than we found concerns about the United States. Both former President Trump, who has been president before, and Vice President Harris are known figures. They're not new as in 2016. People didn't know who is President Trump or candidate Trump. The second point I'd make is there is a relative or comparative net assessment on preference. And that's usually around Asian preference for predictability. And on that score, certainly there's a bias or a tilt towards Vice President Harris. Simply because of an expectation of predictability. And less predictability on the part of a returning President Trump. The third point I'd make is that the impulses, motives, and drivers of U.S. domestic and international actions are increasingly front and center of Asian concerns. How did we get to both parties opposing Japan's purchase of U.S. steel? How did both parties get to opposing TPP? How did both parties not raise a hue about the collapse of the digital trade agreement in the WTO? How did both parties get to not approving multilateral trade agreements? How did both parties get to this stage that we find ourselves in? And those trump a view, I shouldn't use that word in that context, that exceeds specific concerns about a particular human as a candidate. Because these are structural. Len and I were talking on the walk over about structural versus personalities. We're now jostling both structures and personalities in a more fundamental way in my assessment. This even exceeds the concerns we saw in 2003 about the U.S. decision to invade Iraq, which raised lots of questions in Asia, and comes at a particular time because the fourth question of uncertainty is, will there be attention to Asia at all? And what if there isn't? Asians like attention. They don't want too much attention. And they want the right kind of attention. And that's on the demand side. Our supply side doesn't necessarily vector with demand side often. You find this out in 9/11, you find this out in 2003, you find this out in 2010. So you can map it. So I think there's a lot of concern with Ukraine, Middle East, domestic drivers, what I call insulationism in a new piece that's coming out. Not isolationism, but insulationism. Reshoring, rebalancing, returning home. The fifth and final thing I'll say about uncertainty is it is important to understand the lens through which I think Asia sees this. And I want to make this point, and Len can talk about Japan, which we found to be the least a representative of this, but Korea, I'm sure my good colleague Nicholas will say more about Korea. We found that there are a particular group of countries, three: Taiwan, Philippines, and South Korea, who are U.S. partners / allies, who face, in their view, particularly acute and imminent threats from PRC, who have high expectations of the U.S., but whose domestic politics are most riven and divided. And so always remember that the way in which they view and lens our elections or our Asia policy on the eve of elections is through the lens of very divided. Just look at Taiwan. Look at Taipei. TPP, DPP, KMT, jostling, navigating fisticuffs in the legislative yuan, in ROK, a split National Assembly versus president, elections looming in ROK, in a year and a half, roughly. And the Philippines, near political warfare between Duterte, Caprio, the vice president, and Mr. Ramos Jr. So what we have is very divided politics, which makes the uncertainty even more complicated through the lens of each. So let me end with quick comments on this continuity. In this context, what's continuous? 3 or 4 things. 1, continuity exists because of the hardening of U.S.-China relations, which appears to now be institutionalized or structured. 2nd continuity. The securitization not just of security, defense, and foreign policy, but the securitization of the thing that Asians care most about, which is economic, commercial, and technology policy, which allows a very different kind of hedging than security and defense. 3rd, the continuity, actually, if you dig down deep, the continuity of a lot of issues that you wouldn't think of between these candidates or between these last 2 administrations. More I'm not going to get in front of Len, but more institutionalization and operationalization of the U.S.-Japan alliance, more operationalization of the U.S.-Korea alliance, the development of the Quad as a more institutional feature of our relationships in the region, more reach out to the Pacific Islands. There are continuities, both affirmative from the Asian point of view and negative, such as protectionism and securitization of crimes. So the bottom line is that there are worries, but this uncertainty and continuity go hand in hand. And once we get a result here and the development of policies by next spring-ish, 25, we'll have a better sense to be able to see where they are. But that's the state of play as the overall picture today.
Thank you. So I think our plan is to pivot for you talking a little bit more about South Asia and Southeast Asia for a few minutes and their views, if that's what you were ready to do.
Sure.
And then talk about
Korea and then Japan.
Yeah.
South Asia, look, we didn't cover every country in South Asia. I just got back through a swing through Singapore, Thailand, Laos, Vietnam, etc. And I'll say the following about Southeast Asia. Classic, and in my judgment, my words don't attribute it to anyone else, very able and nuanced hedgers. What I've said before is Southeast Asia has wonderfully internationalized their autonomy. They use ASEAN as a way to hide behind giving up national sovereignty, not to delimit it, but rather to protect it. They use multilateral relationships, whether it's Malaysia's bid for the BRICS or Indonesia's possible bid for the BRICS, or what have you, to further internationalize their multilateralism beyond ASEAN. And they're cutting deals left and right with big regional countries, whether that be Japan or Korea or Australia or India or the EU or anything else. The United States, I'll simply say that for all of the pieces that appear in journals, foreign affairs, all kinds of things, think tanks, America is losing Southeast Asia was one title. I'm not attributing it to the author, who knows the editors may have the title. Has China won? This narrative exists, But meanwhile, governments, and having just come back last week from the region, governments are doubling down on trying to keep the U.S. in. So Indonesia has signed a comprehensive strategic partnership. Vietnam is there for the one-year anniversary for a dialogue with the Vietnamese government on the U.S.-Vietnam comprehensive strategic partnership. And they're trying to make lots of inroads to stabilize and lock in certain relationships. Singapore has extended their defense agreements with us. They bought F-35s and now park them in Guam. And if the Singaporeans have any illusions that China does not see parking F-35 purchase from the U.S. at Guam as part of a U.S. alliance network, then there's a different perception of what their strategy is. There are other issues for Singapore. Thailand, as you know, is a long-time ally. In the Philippines, there has been a dramatic change since the Duterte and Marcos governments, but I think that's very, very fraught right now as Philippines moves towards midterm elections and then subsequently new presidential elections. So your guess is as good as mine about what happens between the struggle between the Marcos and Duterte family and how it plays out. I'll be in Manila next week for the first South China Sea dialogue that Manila is hosting, the government is hosting, and we'll have a better sense of sort of just exactly where the line is, where Philippines may ask us to declare an armed attack against the Philippines and therefore call into action the mutual defense treaty that we have with the Philippines. So that's Southeast Asia. On India, I'll simply say the Indians feel quite comfortable. They're not worried about either administration. They feel that they have a structural driver towards an improved U.S.-India relationship predicated on three things. One, the China concern in the United States and the hardening of U.S.-China relations. Two, India's own hardening on China related to the border troubles. And three, a huge Indian-American lobby, roughly equally split between Republicans and Democrats. There are some clouds on the horizon relating to treatment of ethnic nationals of the United States, as you've seen in Canada, fracas of Indians and Canadians. There are these issues, they're real issues, they're not to be dismissed, but overall, India has managed to ride through its position on Ukraine, ride through its position on non-alignment, and ride through its position even on some of these more sensitive human rights and democracy issues under the current hardening of U.S.-China relations. And they expect it to continue. Are they right? Not absolutely sure, but my betting is that they're right. So let me stop there on India and Southeast Asia.
Okay, thank you. I'm sure we'll explore more some of the things that you mentioned. I had a lot of questions.
Sure.
So Nicholas is going to introduce some of the perspectives from the Korean Peninsula.
Thank you, Len. Thank you all for joining us. It's really exciting to be here at the University of Virginia and to talk about what we've heard and what we've found in this report and kind of in these broader contexts of how Asia and then in this context Korea in particular is viewing all these things. Because there is this sort of immediate reaction to a candidate or the candidate that might win and the policies that the Koreans might have to deal with or any of these countries would have to deal with. But it is in that larger, broader context of these concerns and questions about the U.S. and what the U.S. is going to do. So for Korea, it's really the two kind of key aspects of the relationship with the United States. One is the military alliance, and then the second is economics. And then this third aspect is the current U.S.-China competition. And so these are three areas where Korea is viewing a lot of these concerns, issues, and policy options that they'll have to deal with after the elections. So let me give you just kind of Korea's context, some of their concerns, and then some of their possible responses, both kind of immediately and then in the broader context. So for South Korea, they had the legislative elections in April, and that really just kind of highlighted more of this divided politics that we talked about, where the opposition party gained some seats, so they have dominant control in the National Assembly, but not kind of the overall that they can impeach the president or do some of these larger things. But you still see this difficulty in doing things through the National Assembly for President Yoon and his Conservative Party. President Yoon has had low poll numbers and popularity numbers throughout his tenure as president. He hasn't really been too concerned about that, but it is the sort of political capital of being able to do things within the country that is limiting him in that aspect. And you also have scandals in both parties, just some big issues and scandals that are lowering the popularity of both parties and lowering their ability to really focus on issues that need to be done in South Korea. And then they have a larger sort of how to deal with China, their economics, how to deal with China in the security realm, and then how that interacts with the rest of the way they're dealing with the United States and other countries in Asia. So for the kind of the concerns that Korea has, when we were talking to various policymakers and experts in Korea, one was the military alliance we talked about. And so it's really, the alliance has been a huge part of the U.S.-Korea relationship. It's been broadened beyond this military context. But there still is this concern that we haven't been able to figure out the North Korea problem. North Korea still is able to develop its nuclear weapons, develop missile capabilities, threaten South Korea in various ways, and the alliance hasn't been able to address these issues in key ways. And so you have this recent border tensions with North Korea and South Korea. North Korea was sending balloons and trash into South Korea. Now North Korea is claiming South Korea is sending drones with leaflets into North Korea. We had North Korea blowing up parts of roads that would connect North Korea and South Korea recently. So these tensions are really there and can easily sort of spiral out of control where you're going to have more and more issues between North and South Korea. And the part of the aspect of concern about the alliance not being able to deal with North Korea is part of the concern of the kind of immediate concern of the Biden-Harris transition, because the Biden-Harris team has helped out with South Korea, but hasn't been able to really deal with North Korea in a focused way. But then, in the larger context, in the broader context, it's how does the United States and South Korea deal with North Korea? And then there is this another aspect where parts of South Korean society feel that the answer is going nuclear, is getting nuclear weapons and doing that. And that conversation is still prominent and is still an aspect of U.S.-South Korea relations. So the U.S. has tried to have better consultations about nuclear weapons and how they're used and have better avenues for talking about that. But there is still a segment of South Korean population that feels that nuclear weapons for South Korea is an option, and for an option for dealing with that. In the short-term context, kind of with Trump, is will President Trump, if he gets elected, will he reach out to Kim Jong-un and try to do what Kim Jong-un again? And so the idea that would he reach out to him, would he leave South Korea out, would he consider some of South Koreans' concerns? That's sort of an immediate way. Would President Trump reduce or remove troops from the Korean Peninsula? This is something that President Trump talked about when he was in office and then in the campaign. And then lastly, would Trump demand a renegotiation of the special measures agreement that was recently done? But then recently he said that South Korea should pay $10 billion as part of this relationship. So those are kind of the immediate concerns with the South Koreans. But again, it's in this larger context of how do we use the alliance to deal with North Korea? How do we use the alliance to deal with security issues throughout Asia? That is the theme and concern that was throughout our conversations. The next one is the economic side of things. This is big for South Korea, hugely reliant on trade and economics. It's a key part of Korea's aspect of going from developing country to developed country and interacting with the rest of the world. And so their concern was that they needed broader support for the U.S. on trade, but there was an understanding that that's just not politically viable right now in the United States. And so you have this aspect where South Korean companies have been able to have some success working within these new policies in the United States, doing some key investments that are related to the Inflation Reduction Act and the CHIPS Act, and investing in key sectors of the society and key regions of the country, key states of the country. And so South Korea has done that, but they realize that those policies can change either under a Harris administration or a Trump administration. And this is part of that securitization of economics that Satu talked about, where you can have a change in focus of what industry you want to do, of what aspect you want to do, or what company you want to use. And there is concern that South Korean companies would have to adjust to that again as well. Again, the Indo-Pacific framework that the Biden has come out with, the Koreans liked it, but there was an aspect of having more to it. And again, reaching out to that broader aspect of trade, broader aspect of having a larger economic policy in Asia. Again, big aspect of Korea and its development and being involved in Asia and the rest of the world. And then the question of will it still stand if President Trump comes in. So again, kind of the immediate concerns of can the Harris administration broaden and expand the international or the Indo-Pacific economic framework, or will Trump lose it? But then the broader context of wanting more from the United States economically in Asia. And then the last part is just kind of the trade deficit versus their investments and tariffs. This is again a kind of specific issue and specifically kind of tied with some of the Trump campaign conversations and talk. Koreans pointing to the investments they've all done and worked on these investments, but they know that their trade deficit is there, and that is a key sort of focus for President Trump and his campaign is the trade deficits. And then the tariffs across the board aspect, or tariffs in general, difficult for Korean companies to deal with, for the Korean economy to deal with, and then not just the United States, but how does that impact their economic relationship with China and the other countries that they've been dealing with in this aspect of trying to understand and adjust to all these different economic policies that we have and that the countries are dealing with as well. And then lastly, just being this U.S.-China competition and the concern of being locked into a U.S.-China competition where everything is funneled through a U.S.-China competition. A big concern for South Korea. They have relationships with China in many different areas, particularly on the economic side, but they don't want to see sort of being locked into that. And so they're trying to, we talked to suggested ways that South Korea is trying to navigate this carefully. One is, looking at the U.S., Korea, Japan trilateral, using that aspect of multilateral approaches, but then also agreeing to come back and work within the China, Korea, Japan trilateral and sort of balancing things out. Another aspect is the Taiwan contingency. So how are U.S. troops used in the Taiwan contingency? What does that mean for South Korea, South Korean troops, South Korean assets? Will they get pulled into that? Now, President Yoon has, in his work to be closer to the United States, has put in or allowed or agreed to Taiwan segments in joint statements. So where they've talked about the U.S. and Korea's opinion on Taiwan and how that would approach. But there's a concern that might be too much, and so the Yoon administration now there's talk about the administration trying to navigate it a little bit more carefully on what statements they're putting in about Taiwan and when they're not making statements about Taiwan with the United States. So again, sort of navigating that initial reaction between Harris and Trump, but then in the broader context, this is still going to be there because of the structural aspect of U.S.-China competition and the focus of U.S.-China relations. So those are the concerns, and then just through the responses, as Len talked about, there is a sense of preparation. These countries are being prepared. And Korea has felt that they've dealt well with the Biden administration and its officials and people that have possibly with the Harris administration, and then as well with the Trump administration. And so they're trying to, policymakers are trying to encourage people to realize that it is a negotiation with the United States, or especially with the Trump administration, and that South Korea has done well with that in the past. They renegotiated the Force FTA under the Trump administration. so that when these topics come up, especially in the Trump administration, while it may sound initially annoying or concerning when he throws out large numbers or has these things, to try to take it as a negotiation and go back and forth with the Trump administration on that. And another way is to really point to those investments, lean on congressional support and local support with those investments, with those congressmen and senators from those states, those governors from those states. And then as an aspect of that is that leaning on the structural aspect of the United States, where we have a bureaucracy in South Korea that has cooperation amongst many sectors of our society and government, and we can use that to help have your policy connected with the United States and understand, have the United States understand where South Korea is coming from in all these situations. And then lastly is to sort of continue its commitment to the alliance and demonstrate the broader aspects of the alliance, not just on the military side of things, but all these areas of cooperation is there. And so that's another way that South Korea has talked about being prepared for either scenario when it comes to that. So again, we have lots of these dynamics for South Korea where there's trying to immediately understand what a candidate may do when they come into office, but then these larger contexts that are still going to be there no matter who's going to be in office and how those going to be addressed. So again, these are really key concerns, and the report tries to talk about both those, the immediate ones and then the broader context. So that's for Korea, and then we'll talk about all these little things.
Thank you very much. So I'll step into the role of being on the panel for a moment and talk about Japan. One difference is that I'm not a contributor to this report, and I don't work for the East-West Center. So I might speak a little more frankly than these guys who have been very carefully, summarizing the questions these Asian countries are asking about the direction of U.S. policy without characterizing it too strongly in a way that would make them seem like they were really worried about one possible election outcome. So, but I think my views on Japan have a lot of consistency with what you've been hearing from the others and what's in the report chapter about Japan. The structural constraints make the situation that Japan is facing with either a Trump or a Biden administration a lot less of a worry than I think countries like Europe countries in Europe are perceiving. So Trump has openly questioned whether he wants to stay in NATO and whether he's going to make such aggressive demands that the NATO countries increase their defense spending that they might be cut off from the support of the United States. He has not made those kinds of comments about Japan. And the Japanese know that both the Democratic and the Republican Party see the major challenge to the United States over the long term coming from China, and that gives Japan a lot of assurance that the United States will remain on their side, whoever is going to be the president. But I think one difference with a country like India that we heard about, the Indians seem to have a lot of self-confidence that it doesn't really matter, they can handle things on their own. The Japanese don't have that kind of confidence. And although all these countries have anxiety about the rise of Chinese economic power and the rise of Chinese military potential and its aggressive moves in the seas around China, I think Japan is more nervous about this than any other country. And that's because they're on the front lines. If something, one possibility is that the Chinese will test the alliance by challenging Japanese control over the unoccupied Senkaku Diaoyu Islands. There are no people who live on this island. They're a subject of a long-standing territorial dispute, and the Chinese have been persistently challenging the Japanese Coast Guard around these islands for something like 15 years now. So there's a great anxiety about whether the Americans will be there in a contingency that really only affects these unoccupied islands. Would they treat that as such a major issue that the U.S. military needed to deploy? So they've been worried about that contingency for a long time. They also look at the Taiwan situation, and they see that if something were to happen there, where the Chinese blockade the islands or threaten them militarily, they see that Japan will be quickly involved. Whereas the Koreans imagine that they could stay on the sidelines. And they certainly want to stay. I think they want to stay on the sidelines. Maybe you can't say that. But the Japanese increasingly are recognizing that if something happens in the Taiwan Straits, they will be involved, and they will be on the front lines. Japanese are very aware that the missiles that China has today can rain a huge amount of destructive force onto the military bases of the United States in places like Okinawa, but they could also hit other parts of Japan. If this becomes a significant military conflict, Okinawa will be taken out of the fight very early on. The U.S. won't be able to operate from there, and the U.S. will try to operate from other parts of Japan. They're seeking a use of civilian airports in these kinds of contingencies. So cities all over Japan could get caught in a fight with China over Taiwan. So there's a lot of anxiety on the Japanese side about not only will the United States be there, but to what degree will Japan be exposed if this comes to a fight. So that's, I think, a difference with some of the other countries we can explore more in the discussion. Another reason, you heard about some of the recent developments that are causing anxiety in the region. China's increasing assertiveness in the South China Sea as well as the East China Sea. And the recent murder of a 10-year-old boy in Shenzhen in the southern part of China by a Chinese nationalist. Of course, that was just one incident. It doesn't involve the Chinese government, but some Japanese take this as a sign of growing Chinese nationalism and the feelings on the part of Chinese toward their country. And so they want to make sure the U.S. is on side. This is the reason why, back in 2016, when Trump first won the election, Prime Minister Abe was the very first person who got on a plane and flew to New York and visited Trump Tower without fully having discussions with the U.S. government. He wanted to be the first one there to show that Japan was ready to work with Mr. Trump before he even got into the White House. This really set the stage for Prime Minister Abe emerging as sort of a Trump whisperer during the first Trump administration, when virtually every other world leader, I think of Angela Merkel and the British leaders, faced all kinds of mistreatment by Mr. Trump. Abe succeeded in avoiding this kind of treatment and convinced Mr. Trump that Japan was a vital ally of the United States, and convinced Trump, among other things, to reiterate that the United States would be there in some sort of an East China Sea, Senkaku Islands dispute. So some of the most important things that Japan cared about, Trump was willing to deliver. And they, I think, would have expectations that will continue if Trump were to win this election. But the economic policies, Japan did not emerge unscathed under the first Trump administration. Almost immediately, he started talking about the trade issues involving Japan and Korea and other countries, and imposed sanctions not only on China. I think the best known tariffs that Trump adopted were the tariffs on China, but he also adopted tariffs of 25% and 10% on Japanese steel and aluminum that reduced dramatically Japan's exports of these products to the United States. He left them there for the entire term of the Trump administration. It wasn't until 2022 that finally the United States stepped back most of those sanctions on the Japanese. And so when candidate Trump speaks about putting in place 10 or 20% tariffs on all goods, Japan has experienced that on a few products and knows exactly what this would mean if all of Japan's exports were suddenly subject to these kinds of tariffs. So, I think they share with Korea and a lot of other countries a great anxiety about the Trump administration's trade policy. They don't openly speak about it. They hope maybe this is a campaign rhetoric and that he won't actually do it. But they have to prepare for this possibility and have to be concerned about it. So it's been interesting to see that Japan has had a great continuity of the Liberal Democratic Party in charge of its government. The LDP has been out of power only 4 years in the last 70. Okay, in the last 70 years, only 4 years have they been out of power. And so when we talk about Japanese elites' attitudes towards these elections, it's easy to only talk about the LDP, unlike these other countries, because there isn't a whole lot of chance of changing of government at the moment. And the LDP, as a conservative party, has a long history of having great relations with the Republican Party that go back especially to Ronald Reagan, and then grew during the long prime ministership of Mr. Abe, and earlier during the Koizumi's prime ministership. All these prime ministers from the LDP developed excellent personal and staff relationships with the LDP and the Japanese government, and so the Japanese have long felt that they would be more secure under a Republican Party, because security policy was very dependable. It was more hawkish than the Democrats, and on trade policy, the Republicans were not protectionist in the past. Okay, so it was a pretty good deal for them. But what's been interesting is to see the LDP come to the realization that actually the Democrats might offer more reliability on these issues going forward. And I think that if you got them to say this, they will never say this, so please don't attribute it to LDP elites. But if you press them, I'm sure they would prefer many of them would prefer a Democratic Party victory at this presidential election, because they would have the continuity of security policy that they have seen under the Biden administration, which has re-emphasized alliances and has expanded the cooperation on the security affairs, and has actually taken a few steps, like this aluminum steel step, that shows that they're not as protectionist as the Trump's Republican Party. And that doesn't mean they don't have some concerns. They are bothered by the way Nippon Steel's bid for U.S. steel is being treated during the presidential campaign, with candidate Harris openly saying that she would oppose this merger or acquisition. So, but the Trump administration is not doing anything different on that front, and so it's not a deal breaker for the Japanese. So the bottom line so one other thing I want to talk about, the recent leadership election in Japan. So I think this got very little coverage in the United States, but Japan has a new prime minister. Okay, Mr. Ishiba won the LDP leadership contest that took place at the end of September, after Prime Minister Kishida announced that he would not seek re-election to the leadership of the LDP. And so you had 9 LDP candidates, kind of a wild free-for-all of LDP, ambitious LDP politicians, to see who would be the new LDP leader and become prime minister. In the past, one of the major things that the voters in this contest, who are mostly Diet members, were paying attention to was how would this potential leader deal with the United States. This is a very important issue in Japanese thinking about who should be a leader. Abe was very popular within the LDP, among other reasons, because he dealt with the U.S. so well. Okay? But Abe was assassinated in 2022, and now we have another generation of leaders, and it wasn't clear who was the new Trump whisperer. This summer, when it looked like Biden was fading, and it looked like Trump was going to win, a politician named Taro Aso took a trip to the United States to try to communicate to the Trump people that Japan wants to work with you and try to prepare for a possible Trump victory. And it looked like one of the people who might be prime minister would be a particular person who had a reputation for being good at dealing with the United States, or experienced at dealing with the United States, and experienced with working with the Trump administration. But in this 9-person competition, those people who had a reputation of that kind all faded. And instead, the person who won has had the least interaction with the United States, even though he was defense secretary and certainly worked with the United States in that role. He has been the most outspoken among all these candidates in questioning the reliability of the United States and suggesting that maybe Japan needs a Japan NATO to buttress its security reliability. And that's something I might want to talk about with these guys when I shift to my moderator role. But it is a testament to, I wonder if Biden was still the candidate for the Democrats and looked like he was going to lose, if the LDP would have instead chosen somebody who had more of a Trump whisperer reputation. I think there was enough confidence that the other outcome could happen, and that Harris might be in charge, that the LDP felt comfortable choosing Ishiba as their prime minister, even though there's greater, I think, risk or uncertainty about how he will manage the U.S. relationship. All right, so those are our prepared comments. We're going to shift to a few moderator questions before bringing you in as an audience. So I think we have prepared, by the way, our event is supposed to, I'm double checking here. We're supposed to wrap up by noon, so I think we still have plenty of time for a little moderated discussion and then having you join our conversation. So my first question to Satu is about the Asian NATO. So to help, a background to this, why is Ishiba interested in this idea? The nature of relations in the region have been quite different from those in Europe, where NATO has been the security framework. NATO is all for one and one for all. It's a multilateral alliance that makes decisions by unanimity. So all the members of NATO have to agree. And they're all supposed to come to each other's aid if any one of them is attacked. So it's a multilateral alliance. In Asia, the United States has a set of bilateral hub and spokes alliances with the countries that we've been talking about. Some of them are very formal alliances, like the U.S.-Japan alliance, where the U.S. has made a very clear commitment to the security of Japan. Others are more informal, like the partnership with India. When Japan looks at the way NATO has acted in the Ukraine war, it gets a little bit envious that when Putin decided to attack Ukraine, he has been very careful to not attack any of the NATO countries on his border. Because he knows that if he crosses those boundaries, it's going to involve all the NATO countries taking Ukraine's side and taking on Putin. So Japan doesn't have that kind of confidence that in some possible contingency involving China, that China's going to attack only Taiwan, and because it is so worried about the U.S.-Japan alliance. I think Ishiba's thinking is, wouldn't Japan be more secure if there was a NATO-type alliance where any crossing of those boundaries for example, an attack on Okinawa, would be trigger a multilateral response, one for all, to contain the Chinese threat. Okay? So, having explained the attractiveness of this Asian NATO idea, at least to one Japanese person who happens to be Prime Minister, what are the other Asian nations, and maybe you can start with India, thinking about this kind of a framework as a possible future structure?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I myself am not fully sure about where the water's edge is on Ishiba's concept of an Asian NATO. Who does it include and exclude? What are the boundaries? What's the time? So first of all, it's a concept. I'd like to know, so what does that mean? I can tell you that countries in Southeast Asia would be very alarmed by that structural setting because they are, as I said, polygamous in their international relations, and deliberately so. And they find this sort of multiple internationalization, as I mentioned, of their autonomy very useful to them, whether that's individual countries or institutions. So they are looking at joining lots of institutions precisely in order to gain and leverage. Now, the third, India also, I'm unaware of any ministry in any Southeast Asian capital or any ministry in India or the Ministry of External Affairs issuing anything about a conceptual Asian NATO. But given their historical track record against such collective defense agreements, my guess is they would be very reticent to. I do want to flag there's three things that are interesting to me about the Asian NATO concept, and this occurred well before Ukraine, but I think is particularly a missed element today, and that is, I think, as you said, Japanese who look at NATO's response to Russia in Ukraine are increasingly, Japan is worried not only about China, but Russia. And Russia's ganging up on it. And you've seen some of this on the operational side of Russian flybys and Chinese-Russian maneuvers in the north and on Senkakus. So I think it's concern about both, and I think that's sort of concentrated the thinking. The final thing I'll say is there are now three structures that are, I think, particularly important and quasi or proto collective security arrangements at a very low level, far below the NATO threshold. But they're important for their trajectory. One is the emerging US-Japan ROK trilateral, because it is my view that it would be very difficult to contain any Taiwan contingency to the issue of Taiwan. It will involve multiple partners down through sea lanes for nuclear subs, through the Sunda Straits in Indonesia, through monitoring our forces in Diego Garcia, coming through Chinese carrier battle groups in the Western Indian Ocean. It'll affect all kinds of things. So I think that's one. The second is the Quad is not at all an alliance arrangement. India is not an ally. Australia and Japan most clearly are, and the US, Japan, Australia is very critical in this. But that has a platform to be able to harness troops as it did in a humanitarian assistance disaster relief in 2004. And the third and most important element, where there's already a proto-NATO type structure that can be built on, is the Indo-Pacific Four of NATO. Remember, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, and Korea are NATO observer members. And that is a quite logical ability to coordinate with NATO forces in theater and, if they wanted to, use that as a way of building these quadrilateral trials. Now, is that what Ishiba has in mind? I don't know. I simply don't know one way or the other what he has in mind. But I wanted to lay out that I think Russia is a bigger and growing concern of Japan as not only in its own terms, but in alliance or alignment with China. Though there are some Japanese who'd like to find a way to if you will, wedge between China and Russia, wedge them apart from each other. And there's that thinking too. But there are these other kind of features that they might be able to build on or keep alive without establishing a new NATO kind of concept, building a new structure.
So my next question is to Nicholas, more about South Korean politics and its relationship to U.S.-Korea ties. So you did talk about how it's a divided political system, much more than in Japan, and we've seen alternating a progressive party and a conservative party in Korea, and the policy of the Koreans towards U.S. security cooperation has changed a little bit over the course of those transitions. So I'm wondering if you can anticipate this next election and the Korean election, and talk about how that contest might be influenced by how the U.S. election turns out. Okay, because the U.S. election will know the result before. So if Trump is the president, how will that affect how those parties situate themselves against each other in articulating their foreign policy versus a Harris administration?
Interesting, yeah. I think there's one is the current aspect of the two kind of leaders. So President Yoon and then the opposition leader of Lee. He ran for president, lost to President Yoon, very close election, but he's still trying to keep his name in there. Seems clear that he's trying to be prepared to run again and for the next time. And so whether he can kind of sustain that momentum, still be seen as the leader of the opposition, and maintain that aspect of leadership capability and just carrying that over to the presidency is hard to tell, but he seems to be kind of in the front runner seat to do that. For President Yoon, it's unclear, to me at least right now, if he has a successor in mind, right? So in the South Korean system, you can't run again, so it would be someone else from the conservative side that would be running, and it's unclear to me if he has someone in mind that would take his place, or if he has an idea of kind of what he wants to continue from this administration beyond just sort of better U.S.-Korea relations. So it's this sort of uncertainty right now of where the conservatives would be by the time the election would come. But I do think there is an aspect of what you're talking about, and kind of similar to the Japan situation, where they're having to calculate how are we going to respond to the United States, or how is our candidate going to be able to deal with the United States. So I do think there will be calculations in that and positioning in that from the candidates as they move forward, or as they kind of position themselves to be ready for that election when it comes in a couple of years. But I do think there is this aspect of just the difficult dynamics of the internal parties that they have right now, with all the scandals, with all the different factions that seem to be in there, that it might be a tougher sort of internal fight to get out of that, rather than positioning themselves just to deal with the United States.
That's a very interesting question that you raised, though, in the context of Japan. The Japanese political process, while not driven by it necessarily, looks over their shoulder at who can deal with the U.S. That's one of your calling cards to be PM. I wonder, and I say this not knowing nearly as much as because it's about Korea. Certainly I was thinking about your question as it applied to every country in the region. I can't imagine another country where it's so true. In fact, I would expect that a certain dissonance from the U.S. would help progressives if they could harness anti-American views to win elections. Certainly, India has a long history of mixed views of views of the United States, and I can imagine that certain nationalistic elements, whether from the left or the right, still exist in India, whether on the BJP right or the Congress left, about standing up to the United States. I can certainly see in Southeast Asia, you know, the consensus within the People's Action Party in Singapore is the U.S. is the default. Whatever else happens, you got to keep the U.S. relationship. But there are new pressures for the fourth generation leadership in Singapore. They're very different from Lee Kuan Yew or Lee Hsien Loong's era, right? Immigration, Chinese heartlanders, cost of living, other variables. So your question raises a very interesting thing. Is across Asia, I would say it's very loose, but the U.S. is a default element for every country, even for North Korea would rather have to do with the U.S. than with China and Japan or Russia. They would rather. They're not in the mood to right now, but they would rather, I suspect, than trust allows them in. But it may be that Japan is unique in wanting that playing such a big role. I can see other countries playing an opposite, slightly opposite.
So I'm going to ask one last question. This is mostly to Satu, but Nicholas can join as well. And that is to talk about the hedging strategies of the Southeast Asian countries. And I think the ones that are most on the front lines are Vietnam and the Philippines.
Yeah.
And both of them to some degree have hedged over time.
Yeah.
One is a democracy, and the other one is not.
Yeah.
And in the democracy, some of the hedging takes place between parties. One of them gets close to the United States, the other one gets close to China.
Yeah.
Although it's hard to even talk about stable parties in the Philippines. The last two administrations have varied in that way.
Yeah.
So is hedging easier to do if you've got political parties that can take turns of warming up to both sides, or easier to do if you're an authoritarian system with only one party?
Yeah, that's a terrific question, and let me first of all, in the report we didn't cover 10 Southeast Asian countries. We covered the Philippines, Vietnam, Indonesia, and Singapore for reasons that are logistical as much as they are substantive, which is these are 4 countries that really are bad. Let me take Vietnam's case. It just happens to be because I was in Laos a few days ago. I decided to read. I dipped into it before, but never sat down and read from cover to cover Brother Enemy Nine Chanda's book about the Second Indochina War. If you're at all interested in that region or that time period, I urge it. I was staggered to be reminded of the continuity of Vietnamese foreign policy, which seems to hedge around the following. My sort of standard snub speech on Vietnam is, here's a country that has fought 3 members of the UN Security Council, navigated between 2 that shared party affiliations and supported the Communist Party of Vietnam, the VCP. Briefly occupied at the end of World War II by 1 of the Security Council members. And in each case has ended up in a position that Hanoi wanted to be in. And so its ability to navigate between using the VCP to talk to China and use the government to talk to the United States and calibrate its relations with its Cambodian and Laotian neighbors and keep everyone at arm's length while gaining inputs that they wanted, I think it really did the dean of this. That's my assessment. It's a marvel of IR navigation. There have been some pretty hard times, surely the Vietnam War, etc. But even the invasion by Vietnam of Cambodia and subsequent makeup, and after all, the last war that was fought in Asia between 2 countries was Vietnam and China. So their navigation seems to me very good. They have a different set of tools, and I think it's less about democracy than their toolkit, and I'm most impressed by 2 things. Brandon, please, at any time, just tell me I'm off my rocker. One is the toolkit of the VCP to deal with communist fellow socialist party relations, that long history. The second is the government And the third is the new technocracy that's developed as a result of the Doi Moi, or the liberalization of Vietnam over the last 30 years. After all, think of it. Think of it. Vietnam was the only country that entered TPP negotiations and became a TPP signatory when it called for state sector reforms, labor rights, and environmental rights that would have major impact on state formation and state control. All while, under every general equilibrium model, being the biggest winner from TPP, followed secondly by Malaysia. So my own assessment is that they find it easy, not so much because of democracy versus authoritarian, because their very calibrated toolkit that has emerged in Vietnam is quite sophisticated. So they can, technocrats can cut a TPP deal, VCP can push off China's reticence about it. After all, China is now on dock to join CPT, the successor. And the biggest thing is the picture of a VCP leader sitting in the White House with a laptop. Correct me if I'm wrong, first ever visit by the VCP to the Oval Office.
And very important is the party chair.
And the party chair. And this blazing furnace, fiery furnace, whatever the translation is, I speak liquid Vietnamese. I was just astounded 10 days ago, thinking through what's happened in terms of the party, in terms of weeding out corruption and weeding out political opposition. So that when To Lam and President Biden met in New York on the sidelines of the UNGA last week, 15 days ago, you have this picture of a solidified leader. Now here's the rub. What I'm watching for, no, you're watching, is the 2026 National Congress, Party Congress. Because that will tell you how solid To Lam is in his position and whether there's any at the provincial or national level. And so I would say that that navigation is really good. And Manila, I have to tell you, I have a slightly inverted take is, again, it's not democracy, but the use of the anti-US view as a way to harness domestic political support in a still cleavaged Philippines about the relationship with the old colonial master. And yet, the technocratic and bureaucratic elite in the Ministry of Defense, the Department of Foreign Affairs, etc., very aligned with, and even Duterte sought our help on Marawi in the fight in southern insurgency in Mindanao. Didn't bring, certainly exercises were delayed, certainly exercises were called off, certainly deals were cut off. There was talk about removing U.S. troops. But here's the rub. Under Filipino democracy is the only country in Asia that has voted democratically to keep U.S. troops off. So I framed it slightly differently. I think a democracy is less of an important than these other factors in each case. And how they'll play out, I haven't a clue.
Well, thank you very much. Yeah, I appreciate your deep expertise in multiple countries, and the fact that you're visiting all of them all the time. You must rack up a lot of miles.
Yeah, a lot of jet lag too.
So I'm going to turn things over to questions from our audience. So please, you can direct them to any of us and on any of the many topics that we've covered. Several of the students in the class were in my international relations East Asia class.
Oh, you're teaching it
last spring.
Oh.
Yeah. And
then you must have questions.
They must have some good questions. Sure.
I'm not a John Loveland, I'm with the Department of Economics at PhD student there. So I'm wondering, especially like East Asian countries whose growth is fueled by export-oriented policies, how is like kind of the erosion of the Washington consensus perceived in these countries? So we mentioned like the Trump administration and the tariffs sort of was pledged, but also like the Biden administration's EV tariffs, it doesn't really look like the Democratic Party is like leading there. So are these perceived as like a pragmatic response to the loss of manufacturing, or are they perceived
Who wants to start?
I'll start with the way Japan is proceeding them. So one thing, certainly the protectionism within the two parties has ratcheted up in the last, since 2016. But Japan has a long experience of watching the United States talk a lot of pretty words about free trade, but then put in place tariffs on steel. They call them anti-dumping duties. But they're under Ronald Reagan, even though they had a great relationship with him, he imposed these things. Democratic administrations have imposed these kinds of trade restrictions. And so it's in some ways nothing new. And even though the Republican Party was even more, was an extreme version of this, talking a lot about free trade, they too adopted these kinds of trade restrictions. And so Trump was not totally new. He's just now made it official part of policy. Tariff is his favorite word, right? So that certainly has raised anxiety, along with his willingness to actually impose tariffs. Last time he was president, using national security, it's become clear to Asian countries, and especially to Japan and Korea, that in the United States, the president, if he wants to, can wave that word national security and impose almost any kind of tariff on any country in the world. So the game has changed a little, because in the old days, when the protection was imposed, it was after an investigation with anti-dumping duties to make sure that dumping was going on. And
Super 301.
Super 301, Section 301, these always had like a 1 year, at least 1 year lead up until anything happened, because the administration would announce, we're concerned about too much exports coming in from these countries, and they would then do a lot of investigation, creating opportunities for negotiation and for the countries to work something out before anything was imposed. And Trump hasn't been willing to do that. I think he gets too much media coverage when he does things all by himself instantly. And so I expect he will do it the same again. He's not going to have a 1 year investigation before imposing whatever tariffs he imposes. Whereas the Democratic administration, to the extent that it is concerned about things like electric vehicles, I think it's more likely to create opportunities for negotiation.
I really appreciate Len's comments there, and I can't disagree. I frame it this way, at least how I try to organize this issue of consensus and where we're going on global economics. All the studies you can read, you can read Brad Sester, if you follow Brad Sester, or Michael Pettis, or there's a number of analyses done on really how much deglobalization has occurred. Not much, it seems to be still a pretty heavy emphasis. U.S. market last year, 2023, grew more than the EU and China combined. We're at 23 trillion in GDP growth. If you read the Mario Draghi report, the EU that dropped yesterday or the day before, you'll see that the U.S. is viewed by Europeans as the greatest economy in the world for us. Number. And when the Europeans say we are the greatest economy in the world, I take great note because and great pride to think that we must be doing something right. But there are three things on this global consensus thing I'd flag for you. One is that I don't think the executive branch can do much about big trade agreements anymore without Congress. And you have two issues here. One is trade promotion authority and the requirement for congressional approval for a free trade deal. So the UK ain't getting one, Taiwan ain't getting one. These are close allies. It's hard to think of two closer allies, but they're not getting a trade deal. Forget it. It's not going to happen. So Congress is going to play a big role. And the reason I mention Congress is because they have the right under the trading regimes to affect this, and they're there's very little stomach across party lines for such trade deals. So I'll take my state, Washington State. It's the most per capita trade dependent state in the Union. Our whole delegation opposed TPP. This is Microsoft. Medical labs, genetics, you name it, and we export coffee. So I think something is afoot. Second, big picture, is trade has always been, in my reckoning of American history, the big international relations issue except war that has created agita in the political system. Remember Ross Perot, 92? The great second senator. Now I'll say this about Mr. Trump. I think it's he has been consistently clear on anti-trade. He thought NAFTA was bad. He thought every trade deal was bad. Right or wrong, that's for a professional economist to analyze whether he was right. But he has been absolutely consistent. And when on the Democratic side dropped support for TPP in Ohio in the primaries, that was the end of and you'll note that Obama never sent TPP to Congress. So that Hillary Clinton, some say Hillary Clinton would have to stand for it. And the third issue that I think is really important, and it goes to Len's point about Japan. Japan has been the lead goose, this lead goose model, but it's been the lead goose of how the U.S. rejiggers international economics. After all, the securitization of trade, technology, and investment that you see today, outbound foreign direct investment now being reviewed, inbound for sure. But where did these tools start? They started on Japan. CFIUS started by reviewing Japan. Technology controls started because of the Soviet Union and the Comecon countries and the Eastern Bloc and all that. But they also started from Japan's theoretical potential sale of semiconductors in the 80s to the Russians. So the securitization, this rail of trade politics in American domestic, and the fracturing or deconstruction of the consensus in Congress about using levers of congressional legal authority to pursue trade are, to my mind, where we are today. Again, like somebody goes, I have no idea where it goes now, but I don't see any light at the end of this tunnel. And I think this is the big issue because for some time, and this is the central issue of U.S.-Asia relations in my opinion, having worked for the Navy and still working at the Center for Naval Analysis, I less day-to-day worry about operational military stuff on our abilities than I worry about long-term erosion of America's position to want to be in Asia and have Asia want to be connected to the United States because of this erosion of trade and investment over time. The only saving grace might be China may be at the peak of its attractiveness as an alternative to the United States because of three factors: economic coercion, its slowdown, and its own attempt to have an inward China 2025 model that is less dependent and less intersected with Asia. But these are long-term things. It's not like overnight. So that's, I think, where we are. That's a description of the problem, not a description of the solution. I don't know what the solution is, but in domestic politics, I don't see it.
John?
I'm interested in your thoughts about the Quad. And I'm interested in two senses. One, I'm just wondering whether you had any thoughts about if whoever wins the election, how that will affect other countries' approach towards the Quad. But second of all, I'm sort of struck by Len's question about an Asian NATO, in the sense that clearly there's an impulse to having more coordination coordination and cooperation amongst different countries. But it seems to me the Quad might represent another model, which is many of these countries, on the one hand, they're very concerned about China. On the other hand, because China is a growing presence, they don't want to clearly enter into an alliance against China. So you get these forms of, let's call it sub-alliance, sort of more informal cooperation. And I was struck, I remember reading at one point that actually the United States has more joint military exercises with India than any other country. And so I'm wondering, so the first is the future of the Quad, but second of all is what are the strengths and limits of this type of sort of informal sub-alliance cooperation, especially in a strategic sense with sort of the military?
Japan is in Quad too, so
Yeah, I know.
look,
Why don't you make sure the audience knows what the Quad is?
the Quad is the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, initially established in 2007 between Australia, the United States, Japan, and India in no particular order, in order to formalize what had become an ad hoc response on or around the 24th of December 2004 to this massive tsunami and earthquake that shook the Indian Ocean through Southeast Asia. And quite frankly, the National Security Council at that time, on those days when the tsunami and earthquake hit, our officers on duty had to respond. Many of the principals were naturally away from their desks, and there were, officers that were covering. And quite frankly, given the location of the earthquake and the tsunami, the forces most able to respond to humanitarian assistance and disaster relief were Japan, the United States, Australia, and India, because it was located there, and they had both airlift and sea lift capabilities that were unharmed to be able to deploy. So this was completely ad hoc. It wasn't a strategic vision. And by 2007, the idea came along, well, we cooperated so well, why don't we bring HAER stuff to the region when necessary? And there were some political motives and, this kind of thing, diplomatic elements. There was a symbol of 4 great democracies working together, all of those things. Fast forward, fiddles are on. Australia gets nervous around 2007. India-Australia relations are poor. India is not an ally. Everyone else is an ally. Essentially, Australia kind of not a formal ally, obviously. But so it kind of disappears from the world. I call it it goes into the pose in a recent piece. And then in 2017, it gets refreshed. By whom? By the Trump administration. Because by 2017, the Trump administration has issued a national security strategy that's very hard line on China. And they're beginning to turn on China. And this gets harder and harder as the COVID pandemic unfolds. So the Quad is brought back. And what does it start to do after that time? It becomes a public goods arrangement. It's supposed to give infrastructure money. It's supposed to provide COVID relief kits. It's supposed to provide energy transition. Here's my criticism, so I'll end with this. Too much agenda, not enough delivery. I've said this publicly, I know on camera, I've said this in many settings. I will hold to it. We have too many agenda items on Quad and suboptimal delivery of outcomes that matter to the region. And we need to change that and stop adding things that we're going to do and do them. There are 3 other issues that I'll just flag for you. One is, how much security should the Quad be about and how much public good should it be? My own view is that it's inherently a security arrangement when you have 4 allies and 1 great partner, and don't overdo the security and military element. 2, I think, is an issue of institutionalization. Should it be a formal with a secretariat and officer? I don't think it need be, especially when the presidents are meeting on a regular rhythm, once or twice a year, either on the sidelines or deliberately for Quad. You don't need to institutionalize it because in all cases, the government will be driven to support their principles who are attending the meeting, Vice President Harris, President Trump, whatever. And the final issue is, should other people join it? to your last question. And Korea, Nicholas, you tell us. Very mixed views about wanting to join in versus benefit. And my view is you shouldn't expand something that is at the stage that it is in now. Let it just work its package of issues. But I defer to, I don't know Korea is thinking.
No, I mean, President Yoon likes his global pivot, being a global pivot state, having Korea involved in the world. But I think, right now, I think they like being involved with NATO and having that NATO observer status, connection status with NATO versus trying to deal with the Quad, trying to deal with these different dynamics of the Quad. It's there as an option, I guess, but I just see President Yoon liking these other options, other multilateral options beyond the Quad itself. And they have pretty good strategic partnerships with India and Australia to sort of navigate the other Asian security concerns that they have. And if they want other avenues of cooperation in Asia, they have good strategic partnerships.
Yes.
I have two questions. Thank you for talking to us today. I know our China experts are not here, but I was curious what your research found about China's perspective on that.
Oh, yeah.
And then,
I was wondering when someone was going to ask that.
we can touch on that. And then my second question is, you talked about how a lot of our problems come from domestic politics, especially in terms of securitization and how that influences CFIUS and Section 301. And you said that you don't see the solution being within domestic politics. Where do you see the solution coming from? If I didn't mischaracterize your interpretation.
Yeah, I'm not sure there's an immediate solution. That's why you see a lot of different things going on. Japan, and I love Len's view on this because you're also a political economist rather than being a political scientist. You've done a lot of work on Japan's external political economy. But you know, for my money, Japan is the most forward-leaning preserver of liberal international economic order in Asia today through the CPTPP. And is still arguing for that, but I defer to you because I'd love to hear. So I don't think there's an immediate solution elsewhere, but everyone is kind of hedging, right? Even China is trying to join CPTPP along with Taiwan and other countries. And the UK has joined, right? Has the UK joined? I think they joined. Did it go through accession or is it on dock?
I think it's on.
They're first in line.
They're first in line. I lost track of the number of countries that are trying to dock around. On your question on China, let me be very clear. We did interview Chinese experts, not obviously officials. So we tried to stay away from officials entirely so that we could get frank opinions. As you will not be surprised to hear, China does not believe that any candidate is good for China in an environment of hardening competition. Now, and we wrote it, so I'll just say it. There are some Chinese who believe that if Trump comes back, blows up alliances, creates tariffs, creates chaos, creates uncertainty, that could redound to China's favor. There's an anxiety that if a Harris returns, there could be a continuation, if you will, of what might be called establishment policy towards alliances, negotiations, planning out a strategic vision. That could be very dangerous to China because it would harden alliances, harden opportunities against China. What will happen? I don't know. I refer you to the Wired article that dropped in the last 72 hours about alleged progressives in the Harris camp who want to return to an Obama-era U.S.-China relations, which is cooperation on big global issues, and stay away from it. If you read the party platform, not much to go on. We document by numbers, counted words in the party platforms. I believe there are 0. There's one mention of China in the Trump platform, and 4 or 5 in the Democratic platform. If you read J.D. Vance's convention speech, I urge you to read it because it's an extraordinarily interesting framing of the China hardening competition. There are 2 kinds of hardening in China, U.S.-China competition. One hardening is China is a technological threat, a military threat, an economic threat, and a ideological threat. The CCP is an ideological threat. That's the sort of boxed hard version of the US-China competition. The J.D. Vance vision, at least as laid out in his public convention speeches, didn't mention any of those. He mentioned three things. One, fentanyl and the decimation of the American population in particular areas by fentanyl and opioid addictions. Two, and I quote, I paraphrase, don't quote, we will not allow China to build the backs of the Chinese middle class. We will not allow China to build the middle class on the backs of the American middle class. That populist economic view that letting China into the WTO in 1991 was the precursor, along with NAFTA, to the decimation of the American industrial heartland and the decimation of the white working class. Right or wrong, I'm not here. I don't know enough economists can run the numbers. Tell me, there's huge literature on whether we were deindustrializing or why. I don't know. And the third issue is the sort of impact on American culture and society. These are very different views. And we quote President Trump, former President Trump, as saying in this report, I look forward, you see that sofa, I had a very good meeting with Xi Jinping, he's a strong leader, and I look forward to another soft meeting. So, I mean, these are things that have been publicly stated, so there is a question to my mind. I have no doubt there will be a hardening of U.S.-China strategic competition. But I think the locus of that hardening will be in the bills of the Congress and the activities of the Congress. And I am unclear about the new administration. Think about the congressional calendar. I carry one in my pocket. It's my phone because I'm constantly looking at it. Congress works on a very limited calendar. You have 16 hours for the debate on the omnibus budget. You have 12 hours for the debate on the health bill or whatever. They gave a week to China. There is a China week. And if you look at Mr. Johnson, Speaker of the House's speech at the Hudson Institute, he lays out his agenda. Now, I'm not sure what all got passed and what Senate is considering and what will make it into the National Defense Authorization Act. I don't know. I haven't kept up with it. The bottom line is something like 400 bills passed the House on various measures. So if you think China, think of our Congress giving, out of the number of days they are in session, a week to address China needs. That's more time than is given to legislative action on the, 12 or 16 appropriations bills. Yes?
I'm Wendy. I'm a postdoc at the East Asia Center here. So my question is about how do you see cybersecurity as an issue between U.S. and Asia relations? We all know that there's a lot of actions undergoing against the hacking operations, for example, from North Korea, and also misinformation campaigns, and also like data theft or like intellectual property. And I wonder how do you see that as a top issue in relation between U.S. and Asia, and also especially U.S.-China relations?
Huge concerns based on last week, as you saw, with the allegations of more Chinese hacking into the U.S. banking system. And it's a huge issue. Particularly a huge issue where we've pressed very hard on cybersecurity through alliance agreement on not using certain Chinese technologies where American interests are implicated, such as bases and joint shared information channels. We have a major cybersecurity initiative in the Quad, and we have a major cybersecurity initiative in ASEAN to harden defenses against cybersecurity from North Korea, from China, from wherever, Russia, whatever. It's a hotly contested issue. Some countries have signed on board not to use Huawei, for example. Some countries haven't. Some countries have bifurcated their systems. Some countries are using mixing. But it's a huge issue. But I defer. I don't know what has Korea done. Do they still use
think part of it is this aspect of election interference and propaganda in this year of elections. It's a huge topic, and as far as how influential social media was, or different aspects of communication and getting information on your candidate or on the elections in your particular country. And most of the time, it is going to be over the internet versus on TV or radio. So there is this overall concern of election interference and propaganda and how countries are dealing with that. Different countries are doing trying different ways, but I do think that's an area of cooperation that like-minded countries are going to try to latch on to and focus on in the future, is that sort of aspect of election interference or dealing with propaganda. The financial issues is a big one, as kind of we talk about. Economics is huge, and trying to ensure safety of your financial capabilities. Again, it's hard. In some ways, you can do some cooperation on that, but in a lot of ways, that's the internal dynamics of your security systems and your bureaucracy. Last one to watch out for is the warfare. It's the Russia-Ukraine example, and all the things that people are learning from the Russia-Ukraine dynamics of warfare, and then even a little bit with Israel and Palestine dynamics as far as the ways that Israel is able to tap into some of the information dynamics of Hamas and Hezbollah. And so that sort of dynamic is going to be huge as far as cybersecurity aspects of that.
So I think we wanted to save a few minutes at the end for Satu and I to say a few wrap-up comments. Yeah, would you like to?
Do you want me to go first?
Yeah.
Thank you for taking the time to be here. Thank you for the invitation to be here. Thank you to Zoe and Brian for your assistance in setting up this arrangement. Nicholas for joining me on the report and writing the report and doing all the work associated with the report. It will surely be on, I promise you.
Can you make sure you advertise where they can pick up a little?
Yes. I am like the used car salesman of the East West Center. Report will look like this. This is the cover. This is a draft PDF. I shan't give it to you. These are flyers that Zoe has helpfully has with her, which has QR codes to get all our publications that relate to U.S.-Asia relations on the eve of the elections. There's also a 20-year report on the Quad at 20. There's all kinds of other reports. The polling report. There is the Asia Matters for America report, how Asia impacts every U.S. state and congressional district, and the other versions. And so please take a look at our resources. If you need any information, happy to leave my information to you. Please consider joining the East West Center website to get fellowship, exchange, conference, publications, and other opportunities. I am at a grad school, so I'm obligated to say the following. I've started a new initiative at the East West Center called RICE. Don't laugh. RICE stands for Research, Innovation, Collaboration, Exchange. We give small grants to partner with individuals and institutions to do work. Example, Dr. Liz Wishnick, Columbia University, Montclair State, my colleague at Center for Naval Analysis, put in a proposal to look at how Asian observers of the Arctic Council are operating on non-traditional security issues in the Arctic. She got it right. Leads to a set of seminars and publications. Example 2. The Australian Strategic Policy Institute, Washington office, and us did a joint study on the perception in Southeast Asia of US-Australia hardening alliance. Not competition, but alliance. AUKUS, the Quad, and the much deeper integration in the US-Australia alliance. Did they like it? Did they worry about it? Stay tuned for the answers. The report is coming. So those are examples, and I want to shamelessly advertise that I'm going to the board meeting tomorrow morning for the East West Center, and God willing, we'll be ready to announce the new cohort of RICE application call sometime by the end of the year or early next year. So if you want to be on our newsletter, Zoe is the person to see. Give her your email card, etc. And we'll make sure you get early announcements and links to these opportunities. Thank you for allowing me to sell some used cars.
Thank you. So I want to just quickly ask if your programs are open not just to U.S. citizens, but since some of your programs have
Absolutely.
Asian nationals
Absolutely.
as their
Required.
Right.
The better that we work packages with U.S. and Americans and Asians together, the more interesting. Hence the packages I just described as examples, because they involve Americans and Asians working together. If I ever have to testify in front of the Congress about what the East-West Center is doing, I want to be able to cite every time that we pursued your language in the public law that says collaborative research study and exchange between the United States and Asia. We're not doing anything on our own. We do absolutely zero classified work. We're banned from doing it.
So I just wanted to emphasize that because we do have a lot of fellowship opportunities and so on, like Fulbright, that are restricted to U.S. citizens.
Nope.
So this is they offer programs that are deliberately multinational. So I hope that as your careers advance, you look for opportunities to participate in various ways. And I want to conclude by thanking Nicholas and Satu for coming up from DC along with Zoe to make this presentation possible. And I'm looking forward to your report getting out, and I hope you carefully threaded the needle on providing helpful information about how Asians are looking at the elections without offending either party of the United States Congress.
Just put a news alert for East-West Center funding FY25. Satu Limaye makes massive mistake. I'm just kidding. We're going to be all right.
Thank you very much, and thanks for all of you.